Welcome to this sixth webinar as part of the webinar series of the Align project, where we focus each time on how to integrate biodiversity and natural capital into business decision making. This time we focus on the apparel sector and how the sector impacts, but also can contribute to reducing the impact on biodiversity. The main purpose of the webinar series is really to exchange views among business practitioners, experts, and other interested stakeholders. And like that, we want to foster knowledge exchange and capacity building and build a platform for natural capital management accounting. So as I said, my name is Jana. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few house rules to make sure everything runs smoothly today. We would appreciate if you mute yourself to avoid any background noise. As you might have seen, the webinar will be recorded and the recording will also be shared after the webinar, including the slides. We encourage everyone to engage in the conversation as we want to learn from each other, and this is an open space, so feel free to express your opinions and views, but remain polite. You can use the chat box or feel free to raise your hand and voice your opinions or anything that you would like to add to the conversation. We're also using the tool Mentimeter to capture feedback, and the results of the Mentimeter will also be shared at a later stage. We will check what challenges your sector is facing, what solutions you might have that might help others to address these challenges. And as part of the Align project, we will take stock of that, and that will feed into our work. We will immediately talk a bit more about the Align projects. For today, we have my colleague Jacob Bedford from UNEP WCMC, who is a program officer and the Align lead. We have my colleague Justine Saunders from the Capitals Coalition, senior manager and also Align partner. She will be the moderator of today's discussion. Then we welcome Liesel Truscott from Textile Exchange, director of industry accountability and insights. Liesel leads the Textile Exchange benchmarking program, which she will speak more on. She's currently a commissioner to the Capitals Coalition Values Commission, and she serves on the technical advisory group of the International Sustainability Standards Board, the Aligning Accounting Approaches for Nature, Align projects, and the advisory board of the Copenhagen Fashion Awards. That's a mouthful. Then after Liesel, we will hear from Tim Forslund from Citra. Tim explores science-based approaches for quantifying nature and climate benefits of a circular economy. He's Swedish and studied at the Lund University. He's a research assistant at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation in the UK and is currently based in Finland. Today, we will explicitly explore the links between circular economy and how to integrate biodiversity in that, because we noticed that many companies, fashion companies, are really focusing more on how to become more sustainable. There has been a lot of focus on climate change, and now we see a shift that they also want to integrate biodiversity into their decision making. But it doesn't mean that it needs to be an entire new layer on top of everything. There's different entry points, and actually a lot of companies are already doing a lot by focusing on circularity. And Tim will zoom in on that a bit more. Then on the agenda, Jacob, as I said, will shortly introduce the Align project. Then we will hear from Liesel and Tim, followed by Justine, who will present a range of case studies from the apparel sector on their journey, what were their motivations, what methods did they use, and what were the outcomes. And then we will try to involve you a bit more, and we'll have an open discussion where we can discuss challenges, share implications for decision making, what were lessons learned, and what kind of training or education or research needs are there, because we really want to make this useful for you and also for us, that we take this forward and use your inputs as far as a way to guide the project. So before we get started, let's hear from you a bit more. So I would like to ask you to switch to Mentimeter. You can scan the QR codes or go to menti.com and use the codes that is now shown on the screen. And then we can check a bit who's in the room and what your experience are. So we know also when we start the discussion at what level we are. So I'll give you a few minutes to join. I can see people are joining. Okay, so most of the people are rather early in the journey. A few people advanced stages of measuring already. They completed a natural capital assessment. It would be good to hear from them what their experiences were, how they addressed the challenges that they faced on their journey. Yeah, I see 12 people joined. Give some more time. Okay, so we see a good divide between a few people in the audience who are really starting to think about how to conduct a natural capital assessment, thinking about natural capital and biodiversity in general. And then we see like half of the group, based on the representatives, are also at the early stage of measuring. I think it's a good mix that we have today in the audience. Feel free to join the Mentimeter, but in the meantime, allow me to already pass on the floor to Jake. You can continue to complete the Menti and we'll take stock of that afterwards. So Jake, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks for joining us all today. So yeah, I want to give a quick overview of the Align project as a whole. So an introduction for many of you and maybe a reminder for some of you. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So I'll read out the kind of formal overall objective is to contribute to the European Commission's efforts to support businesses and other stakeholders in developing standardized natural capital accounting practices generally and for biodiversity specifically. So Align is a European Commission funded project and it's led by WCMC Europe and UNEP WCMC based in Cambridge, the UK, and the Capitals Coalition, Arcadis and ICF as core partners. And as I'm sure you're aware, there's been a real kind of explosion in this space over the last few years around natural capital and biodiversity specifically, with multiple now standards, initiatives, use cases for biodiversity measurement emerging. And in response to that, there's also been an explosion in tools, in data sets, in metrics and methodologies emerging to help respond to these needs. And I would say what Align tries to do is try to bring this community together to try and come up with some kind of standardized principles and guidance around how businesses can get started, or if they have got started, how they can advance their biodiversity measurement and valuation elements specifically of natural capital management accounting. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So as I said, the aim is to really help improve clarity in this, what can be quite an overwhelming space, and build consensus around corporate biodiversity measurement, developing a generally accepted way or set of principles for businesses to understand both their impacts and their dependency, so their overall relationship with nature. I'll touch on this in a minute, but build from and link to existing initiatives and networks, and really take into consideration what businesses are saying, what businesses are needing, which is why these webinars are fantastic, and the lessons already learned from applying these in practice into the development of our materials, and complement policies within the European Commission. And we had our kind of initial, our first output from the project, our recommendations for a standard on biodiversity measurement and valuation were published at COP15 in Montreal in December. So these are a set of principles principles for corporate biodiversity measurement and valuation. So to trying to, let's say, create some more harmonization in this space. So you might, I don't want to worry too much about all the text on this because I know it's quite small, but the point this diagram is trying to make is that Align is a discrete project, but what we're trying to do is not act in isolation. We are aware that biodiversity is kind of one part of broader nature and sustainability topics, but also that Align itself is a discrete European project. It's not itself a standard setting body. It's not itself a standard setting initiative like GRI or the TNFD, for example. But where we see our impact is that we really try and plug in to all of these different initiatives and projects going on. So it's really kind of one piece in a really big puzzle. But for example, the TNFD beta framework references a lot of the Align recommendations. So it's a really nice route by which the community input through the Align project, which comes up with technical principles, can then feed into these various initiatives and standards. And that's how we see our role of really trying to make sure that this space has some harmonization going forward with the rapid pace that it's developing. If we go to the next slide, please. So just to give an overview of the structure, the objective 1 is establishing and operating a dedicated natural capital management accounting platform, facilitating best practice exchange. Then objective 2 is establishing and operating this business-driven discussion and alignment process to try and streamline and strengthen metrics and methods. Bit wordy, but this is the kind of our outputs, our technical principles, our guidance notes. And objective 3, defining the needs and opportunities relating to education and training, research and innovation to mainstream natural capital management accounting within the business community. So really trying to understand what needs are out there, what are the gaps and what are the barriers to kind of more widespread uptake of biodiversity measurement. If we go to the next slide, please. So as I say, we really try and build a kind of a community consensus, and we have different opportunities to engage within the Align process at different levels. So we have our core Align advisory board, we have our Align technical hub, which is a small group of really specialist technical experts, specifically in the field of corporate biodiversity measurement and accounting. A slightly wider Align community of practice. So these are experts and practitioners working on biodiversity measurement, natural capital management accounting. So that's including both consultants and businesses. And then a wider community of interest who have a slightly more kind of light touch involvement in the project, but who just wanted to keep in touch with what's going on and kind of learn from the outputs. So if you are interested in being involved in any of these, we'll be interested to hear from you afterwards. And I just want to end my little introduction by flagging that we've got a really, really busy but exciting year planned over the coming year. We're developing specific guidelines for site-based application, supply chain application, and the finance sector. So applying our recommendations we published last year to these different levels. So these will be more business-focused, practical guides. We're looking into integrating biodiversity metrics into impact pathways. We're looking into how business measurement can align with the targets of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Package. We're looking at how we can explore measurement solutions to corporate nature positive commitments and the challenges that nature positive commitments bring up for measurement. And we will be developing training materials in the later half of the year, again, to try and facilitate increasing capacity for corporate biodiversity measurement. So where that was a lot of information at once and quite a whistle-stop tour, but I hope that gives a nice overview.
Yeah, Jan is
that
muted.
took a while. I muted it, so I'll begin. Okay, so thank you. And the slides will be shared after the webinar, as I said, so you'll have enough time to go over the information again. And really don't hesitate to reach out to us if you want to learn more about the project or be involved. So now we will hear from our experts, applications from the apparel sector. So first, let me welcome Liesel Truscott from Textile Exchange on stage.
Thanks, Jana and Justine and Jacob. It's exciting to be part of today's session. I'm just going to pop my slides up, hopefully fairly elegantly. Whoops, let me just go back to the start. Yeah, lovely to be part of this session, and I'm very happy that there was a big emphasis on the training and the learning and the exchange and the journey that we're all on, because I think probably most people on this call are more experts in biodiversity and natural capital accounting than I am. But what we've done at Textile Exchange is to really try and support our members on this journey, and yeah, really happy to be part of this learning network. Just checking you can hear me and see my slides. Is that? Can you hear me?
Yes, that's fine, Lisa. Yeah,
Perfect.
sorry, I'll give you a thumbs up. Yeah, good.
Thanks, Fiona. I've just lost everybody's from my window screen, so that's great. A very small sort of context setting on Textile Exchange, just to sort of tee this up a little bit. So a few years. So we're a non-profit. We're global. We focus in on what we call tier 4, so right back at the raw material production in the supply chain, as you can imagine, and the textile industry is enormous, very long and sometimes fragmented supply chains, and lots of impacts and opportunities along every step of that supply chain or supply network, as we like to think about it. So we zoom right back to the start. And I would say, along with what you were saying earlier, Jacob and Jana, there's a huge amount of interest in biodiversity and raw materials and just what that means for brands and retailers and companies right at the other end of the supply chain, how to connect and take some responsibility and accountability and be constructive in this space is a really big and exciting challenge. And that's one of the roles that we have at Textile Exchange, is to support that journey with our members. We do this under what we call our Climate Plus strategy, which means we've got a sharp focus on supporting the industry in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And we have a target of 45% reduction by 2030, aligned with science. And as I said, focusing on that tier 4 and what we call sometimes referred to as the pre-spinning phase. But the plus bit is what interests me the most, and is, I think, really in line with our understanding of how holistic these challenges are, and therefore the solutions and how we need to approach them. So the plus for us focuses in on soil health, biodiversity, and water, but obviously there's a lot within that nexus. And we also like to talk about plus as in being grounded in partnership, and that's another reason why I'm enjoying being here today with you and looking at how that we can learn and share and bring our combined value and resources together. And just on I guess one of the value opportunities that Textile Exchange does bring to this discussion is we've grown enormously over the last couple of years, which once again I think is tribute to the importance of this topic and connecting back to raw materials. So our number of standards have grown. We have now over 48,000 sites around the globe. We have, I think it's closer to 1,000 members now, so it's ticking up almost daily. So that shows our huge connection to scaling or potential to scale. Members range from brands and retailers, but also a lot of manufacturers, raw materials suppliers, producers, farmers, consultants and advisors within that sort of network and community. The benchmarking program that I want to talk to you mostly about today, just to show how that has been our pathway into this topic. We now have around 400 companies involved in that program. So before I jump into the benchmarking kind of story that I want to focus on, I just wanted to mention that there's other areas within Textile Exchange that we're sort of moving this agenda along within, and one of the big sort of signature pieces that we'll be putting out in May this year is a landscape analysis, and that's not to compete or add another sort of tome in the shelf of all the amazing biodiversity reports and analysis and insights that's out there, but it's to sort of focus in on what this means for the textile and apparel industry. We've partnered with the Fashion Pact, which is another sort of signatory group, sort of focusing on biodiversity and nature, to make sure that we're aligning efforts. Conservation International is one of our partners. It has been in many ways with the work that we do. And then we're working with Biodiversify, which is the company that's sort of helping pull this research together to present this analysis. We're also supporting our members on just how to focus in on decision making. There's a lot of materials, there's a lot of standards and certifications out there, and we're trying to get a little bit more scientific with how we advise companies on choices to make, what the different standards cover, excuse me, and on this slide, just sort of pointing out the biodiversity related indicators within two of our kind of tools that are under development. One is more for beginners. It's called the Preferred Fibre Materials Matrix, and that's really a rather static but sort of helpful look at the different standards and then what they cover in terms of the range of social, environmental and governance type areas. Because they're all focus on slightly different things, and it's really to help companies make a choice. And now a little bit more sophisticated, what we call Global Fibre Impact Explorer, once again, still under development, but looking at drawing on different data layers to help companies move towards understanding risks related to various geographies, and with an emphasis on what to do when you've discovered some of the impacts and risks at a geography level within your supply base. You know, what are some of the options? Our standards are also under another round of development. We're looking really extensively on sort of this shift from building on the work that our standards, like many others that have looked very much at practices, into how we then start to look at impacts and bring that into the requirements and the reporting and the sort of the chain of custody, and getting some of that data to start flowing through from farms to you know what brands and retailers and other stakeholders need to understand. That's obviously a whole webinar in itself, so I'm just going to mention that and move on. And the other area that we're exploring, which I think is really exciting, really challenging, is how to start incentivizing and rewarding farmers for some of these changes. And we've developed, in process of developing, an impact incentives program, which sort of, if you like, can bypass the whole supply chain and the premiums that are hopefully involved in adding value from the farm to the final product. But this is a sort of innovative way to get that incentive and reward and compensation back to farmers that you may not necessarily know are within a company's supply chain, and just really looking at other models to support and scale and accelerate the change that we need. So onto the benchmarking. I'm where the time is ticking by, and there's always so much to say, and there'll be questions at the end. But we've leveraged, if you like, the value of benchmarking to help drive companies along a pathway to making improvements. And our program has really focused in on 3 key areas that we think can drive change. So one is to start exploring materials that have a lower carbon footprint. That's an obvious one, and I'm sure we'll hear a bit more about that from the next speaker. Looking also at, when you are sourcing raw materials, and there are benefits to sourcing virgin raw materials from farm groups and communities, how do you make sure that we're integrating outcomes for nature? And then that whole circular economy piece where we're actually looking at reducing the load through innovative business models and ways to lighten the load on our natural world. And of course, there's lots of considerations within this mix, including the just transition towards an economy that is not so dependent on raw materials and the impact that they are generating for nature. So we've come a long way since we started benchmarking. I've just put the model up there on the left to show there was very much a focus on specific raw materials that companies are using. That's still very much part of the program. We've worked really hard with companies to help them understand their portfolio, to look at what preferred materials are on option underneath each of the fibre categories, and most importantly, how to start measuring the volumes of materials that they're using so that they can then start setting targets, at least from an uptake perspective. So that's where we're focused for probably the last 6 or 7 years. And you can see on the chart on the right that from the pilot in 2015, we're now looking at, the pilot was about 57 companies to start with, and now we're looking at, nearly 400 companies that are taking part in this. So that is building a lot of momentum. The lighter green line shows when we introduced our biodiversity benchmark, which was a new component. I'm going to talk a bit more about that now. And even over the course of the 2 years that we've run this, you can see the growth in participation, and that's sort of really reassuring and promising. And our goal is to make sure that we've linked that up with best practices that are coming through the Align process and others that were mentioned earlier. And I guess this slide is really just to show that whilst we're focused on the left on that portfolio approach, the big opportunity now, and where we're focusing a lot with the participants, is how you identify the landscapes from which you're sourcing these raw materials. What are the risks and opportunities, and how do you start to be active more in that landscape approach? When we introduced the biodiversity benchmark, it was during COVID. We were all locked in our rooms. There was a huge amount of interest. And I think, at least from my experience, it was the first time that we'd brought so many amazing experts, like maybe many of you on this call, with companies that were members of Textile Exchange, and really starting to understand that conversation. And our starting point was to say, to take that portfolio approach into the landscape approach, and that would be the bridge to start aligning with things like the science-based targets for nature. And that was really our go-to to anchor our benchmark survey and align the definitions and a lot of the steps within the interim business guide that they had just put out at the time, to build our implementation strategy around their AR3T action framework: avoid, reduce, restore, regenerate, and transform. And that has really helped us kind of build some clarity and alignment. And of course, now we're looking at how that fits within the TNFD, how the Align fits in. And I've got a nice quote from Mark at the end, which I think is helpful for us as well. So yeah, bringing to colour some of those numbers in terms of participation. You'll have these slides, but these are companies that you will all have heard of, ranging from Prada to Burberry to Lacoste to some of the manufacturers that we're also working with, Lenzing, and Aditya Birla and others that are bringing some good insights from the actual production side. We did have 5 key insights that I think I'm just going to run through quite quickly, because I think they're good conversation starters, and we know that when our next insights report comes out, that we we'll be able to sort of reflect on how far we've come. The first one is sort of stating the obvious. There's a huge amount of interest in this topic now amongst our sector, with some fast movers that are sort of leading the way, like Kering, like Burberry, like some of the ones that are very active in driving this agenda. Many companies start from the use of sustainability standards, and I think that's a fair starting point. You know, we've worked hard as an industry to say this is what best practice looks like in terms of more sustainable raw materials production. But of course, it's not the be all and end all when it comes to driving biodiversity improvements. And there's a lot of work that's going on around that space, and obviously a lot to learn and understand and unpack on how standards contribute to a biodiversity agenda. On top of that, some companies are going beyond standards, which is great, looking at restorative and regenerative practices, thinking more in that landscape mindset, I guess, which is something that we're hoping to see continue to improve and grow. It kind of ties in with key insight number 4, which is really about the investment piece. I think one of the most famous ones is Kering's million hectares of crop and rangeland into this sort of regenerative fund to start driving improvements and ways of understanding and measuring impact. But of course, the transparency piece, which takes me right back to that slide earlier, with how do you even start to prioritize where you're sourcing from and how to act for biodiversity once you know that landscape context. So I think this is where we're really looking for more support and advice, and we know that we need to start working harder at. I know Justine's going to talk about case studies. I'm just sort of splashing this slide up here to say we've worked with 9 companies to bring some case studies to our first Insights report, and we've got a lot coming out again when we put out our next report. I just wanted to throw this slide in the mix as well. This is what we're looking at, and I know there's so much great intention on alignment, on looking at where the value addition is, on making sure that we're streamlining processes. And I think it's really exciting for us to be part of these discussions as a sector-driven initiative and lining up with the global agenda. And I want to leave you on Mark Goff's slide, which I really like. You know, there are a lot of frameworks and really great work going on. But essentially, the kind of process of assessing, committing, transforming, and this very important part of disclosing is sort of the door from which you can enter and align on, you know, or kind of work towards aligning with the different frameworks and standards that are going on out there. So that's open to discussion and debate, and I'm going to stop there, Justine or Jana, and hand it back to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Liesel, for a super interesting presentation, all the work that you have done, and I hope during COVID that it didn't get lost, the biodiversity benchmark. I just have a quick follow-up question before we move on to Tim. So what are the immediate next steps now that you launched the biodiversity benchmark and that you gathered these key insights and that many companies are piloting it? Is there anything that is coming up in the foreseeable future or improvements to be made, concrete case studies like to be published, working together with companies? So just to kick off the debate a bit.
Yes, it's a good question. And one of the slides, I'll see if I can just quickly, not to waste too much time, but just see if I can pull up this slide here, which somehow got out of order. But I wanted to end on this this exciting slide. I mean, it's not that visually exciting, but the so yes, we ran the pilot. We called it a beta because we didn't even feel confident that we're ready to call it a pilot, because, as I was sort of saying, we were in sort of lockstep in a way with the amazing work going on at SBTN and the Align project, and GRI are now producing the next round of their standards, and TNFD is rocketing ahead. So we called it a beta. We have run the second version, the 2022 survey, and you can see the growth here. The results will come out in a couple of months, so we're still busy analysing the results, but some highlights, the sort of growth in the number of participating companies. And you can see on the right-hand side the number of companies that have gone from having a strategy for biodiversity in 2020, 8%, to 28% in 2022. Now, of course, that doesn't reflect the quality of the strategy and that sort of, that dimension, but an incredible growth in, I think anyway, in terms of actually producing a strategy to drive biodiversity and so the nature agenda within their companies. So I thought that might answer your question. And did you
Yeah,
see
it
the
does, and
slide?
it's super
Yeah.
interesting to see the impact that it has. Yeah, we did.
Okay, am I stopped sharing?
Yes.
Perfect.
So thank you very much. There is some questions coming into the chat, which we'll address after Tim. So Tim, I welcome you now to take the floor, if you're still there. Yeah.
I am indeed, and thank you very much, both to you and for inviting me also to this webinar. And thank you also to Lisa for a very interesting presentation. There is indeed a lot going on, and I will add a few more points still, but also linking up to what we just heard. So hopefully you would be seeing my slides at this point, and I should just mention a few things about what we do in as part of our work at the Finnish Innovation Fund, Sitra, and a few thoughts about what we have done with the circular economy as a solutions framework to tackle biodiversity loss. So if I just start by saying a few words about the Finnish Innovation Fund, Sitra. Sitra is a combination of the Future Fund and a Think, Do, Connect tank. So we provide insights and analysis. And we also do experiments with citizens, municipalities, and companies throughout Finland, which we try and think of as a sort of green lab where we can test bold ideas and then hopefully scale them up. And for that purpose, we have the World Circular Economy Forum, for instance, and other platforms that we try to push to facilitate partnerships. And we have worked on a bunch of different topics, from lifelong learning to democracy and the fair use of data, and of course the whole nexus that different sustainability topics also comprise. So for instance, with climate and circular economy, and more recently also biodiversity has gained a more prominent role in our work. And as a sort of linchpin to this work, Sitra started the world's first national circular economy roadmap back in 2016. So Sitra led that work in Finland, and that was a process that brought together about 1,000 different stakeholders from across Finland. So from universities of applied science to businesses and labor unions and different government agencies, so trying to co-create a vision of what a circular vision could look like for the future, and based on that, trying to find concrete steps to get to that future as well. And as one part of that work, Sitra has worked quite intensively to push circular economy education across Finland. So even though Finland is a very small country, 3 years ago they had the highest number of learning offerings in the circular economy, not just per capita, but in total. So there's been a lot happening in Finland to make the circular transition happening. And also I will share a few examples of what we've done with businesses and As I also mentioned, the World Circular Economy Forum is an initiative that has been launched by Citra, and this year it will take place in Helsinki in May. So I invite you all to come to Helsinki in May, and one of the sessions there on the second day will be on fashion as well. So I hope we can continue the discussion there as well. Besides working with businesses and working with education, we have also tried to provide insights and analysis to what the circular economy, how it can serve as a solutions framework for tackling climate change. So we try to quantify this potential. So we can see that about half of EU emissions in heavy industry could be tackled by a transition to a circular economy. And last year, we also published a report that looks at 4 sectors, so food and agriculture, the built environment, forests, and indeed fibers and textiles. So taken together, we see that this can, a circular transition in these 4 sectors can halt biodiversity loss in the next decade. But first things first, I know this audience here today, natural capital might be quite a common concept to you, but what do we really mean when we talk about a circular economy? So there are many definitions, over 100 in fact, and when we refer to the circular economy, we talk about a systemic approach to production as well as consumption and materials management that maximizes both value and use. And it applies regenerative principles as well. So we need to talk about regenerative agriculture. And at the same time, when we think of use, it's not enough just to make sure that we maintain the value in the economy. We also need to make sure that we don't just fill up our closets and yeah, so we got to make sure that we have fewer idle resources as well, that we make the most of what we have, basically. And some of you might have seen the butterfly diagram that has been developed by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Essentially, the idea is that you want to get as much value from what you already have by keeping materials and products in the system for as long as possible and at the highest value possible. So for instance, if you think of the right side of the butterfly diagram, we talk about technical cycles, anything from cement to chemicals. You want to make sure that you maintain that value. So if you recycle certain materials, we lose some of that value. So fibers get shorter, for instance, but then it's better to make sure that we reuse, or even better, that we keep existing products and materials in use for as long as possible. And here the apparel industry is a really interesting case because it draws upon both the technical and biological cycles of the circular economy. We have synthetic fibers, but we also have biological cycles. So we can think about a regenerative agricultural system on one hand and draw upon the principles of a circular bioeconomy, but we can also think in terms of reuse and recycling as well. So we can really draw upon both spheres of influence. But if you're trying to pinpoint what we mean by a circular economy, I think it helps to also quantify it. And I think this way of looking at it that has been developed by RISE, so Research Institutes Sweden, it essentially boils it down to 3 principles. That it's about making sure that products and materials last for as long as possible. But like I said, it's not enough just to have long-lasting products, but also making sure that we minimize idling in the economy, that materials and products are used at their highest value, and also making sure that recirculation is another side of it. I think there's a bit of echo in the background, so if you're not on mute, I think it's a hint to mute yourself. And one thing that's not mentioned, but it's part of one of the 3 principles of a circular by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, is also to drive regenerative outcomes in our areas of production. So for instance, regenerative agriculture is one such critical part, because we can minimize resource extraction. That's the end goal of a circular economy, to make more value from the resources that we have and minimize the load that we put on the system as a whole. But we can also make sure that the land that we do have in production, that also drives regenerative outcomes, or is used to drive regenerative outcomes. So I think that is really essential to look at it as a two-pronged approach. So in this study that I mentioned, we find that we can tackle biodiversity loss through the circular economy. And so we looked at 4 sectors with the apparel industry, or as we call it, textiles and fibers is one of these sectors. So we developed 2 scenarios with Vivid Economics, and in a business as usual scenario, we would continue to lose resources, to use resources and lose nature way past 2050. But in a circular economy scenario, we would use fewer resources, and that in turn would enable us to use up less land, which could leave room for nature to thrive. And then if we at the same time derive regenerative outcomes, we can also focus on the 70% and not being confined to the 30%. We can have a bigger impact as well. So I mentioned we have 4 sectors, but if I zoom in on what we did in the textiles and fibers sector, so we had 3 main assumptions behind this sector. So we see that by 2050, the use rate of clothing would increase by 50%, and the recycling rate at the same time would increase to 75%. While we'd applied regenerative agriculture across 60% of the land that we use to grow cotton. So it's looking at it through that lens. And that in turn could free up about 24 million hectares of cotton. And that would correspond to roughly the same size as the UK. So it's a small area compared to the 640 million that we see, 640 million hectares that we see in the scenario as a whole. But that's just down to the fact that the agricultural land globally, it's basically a very big area, as you can also see on this slide, that the food and agriculture sector is dominant. But still, as you see in red at the bottom here, fibers and textiles, even though it's a small area as a whole compared to other parts of our agricultural system, it's still substantial because it's driving a lot of ongoing biodiversity loss. So it's not insignificant. And if we take these 4 sectors together, we can't do it without any of these sectors. But if we have these 4 sectors, we can bend the curve on biodiversity loss already in the next decade. And we also see benefits for climate. We could tackle about 90% of methane emissions in agriculture. And we also see benefits to resilience. We could reduce the application of nitrogen fertilizers by 30%, for instance. But I would like to say a few words about what companies can do. If we know that the circular economy can serve as a delivery mechanism for reaching science-based targets, which has been mentioned by Erin Billman at the Science-Based Targets Network, we were interested in thinking of, could this be a way to use circular economy to reach science-based targets for nature? So what we have done in Finland is to work with 10 of the biggest companies in Finland that represent these 4 sectors, and to see if they could pilot science-based targets for nature in Finland. And we just finished the pilot, so we had the final workshop last week. And I think some of you are probably aware of what the Science-Based Targets for Nature does, but just to give those of you who haven't heard about it a sort of overview, it tells you if your company is doing enough of the right actions in the right places to stay within a safe and just operating space. So it links to the thinking on planetary boundaries, and it takes a different approach. If we start with a circular economy and think that, well, if we reuse materials and recycle materials by this much, how far can we get? This gets it at it from the other way around. How circular do we have to be to stay within a safe operating space? And you just heard the mention to the ARRT framework. So we think that this is an excellent guide, framework for working with tackling biodiversity loss. And that was one of the goals of the pilot as well, to see what can we do to make sure that we um, help companies transition to a circular economy. That's the bonus, but what does that actually give us if we want to tackle biodiversity loss? And we see that this framework was very helpful for companies that had already worked on the circular economy, because it mentions these 4 steps: so avoid, reduce, regenerate, and restore and transform. And that logic is very similar to that used in the circular economy. So that was one of the outcomes of this pilot as well, to see can the circular economy be used as a delivery mechanism. And I think we have, quite promising results from that it is a helpful guide framework for working with that. And to just give you one example of what we have, that we have a list on our website of different companies from different sectors. So many of them are textiles companies from Finland. So if you're curious about how you can use the circular economy as solutions framework, I would suggest that you check our website and our library for more inspiration of different business models that you can use. And as you can see on this slide, there are quite many different circular business models, from extending lifetimes, providing products as a service, and promoting also, resource efficiency and renewability in products. And just to give you one example before I wrap up, of one company that was in the pilot is Reima, and they make children's clothes. And it was quite interesting for them that there's really no one size fits all approach when you work with nature. And for them, they mostly have clothes that are made from synthetic fibers. So their land use footprint was actually quite small when they did their materiality assessment, which is the first step of getting towards setting science-based targets for nature. And they saw that their biggest impacts were from pollution and climate. So for them, their work on, science-based targets for climate was very helpful when kind of starting this work. But in terms of the nature footprint, it was not as big as they had thought. And then one way in which they work with the circular economy, to which also makes it possible to have a smaller nature footprint, is by working with making sure that they have fibers that are at a certain standard, but they also try and work with circular business models. So they have teamed up with, for instance, Mendi, which is a repair service in Finland, and they've also teamed up with another platform, Emmi, which through which you can sell clothes through secondhand. So it's not just about selling more and more clothes. They found a functioning business model to also resell more of the existing stock of clothes. So I think they have shown that you can do a lot without necessarily selling more and more products, and also making a valuable business model as well. And I think, just to wrap up, there are many good solutions also from China, where you have different business models that have tried to provide circular fashion through different service models, with everything from bags to jewelry to much more everyday fashion. So there's a whole range of examples that I think we can learn from there. And just one final example, as I mentioned, without these partnerships, so pairing up with a repair service or a resales outlets, it will be difficult to really transition to a circular economy and to tackle biodiversity loss. And one other example of a Finnish company is, for instance, Lindström, that they provide workwear as a service. And so they have a sort of homogeneous material stream. And since they have this homogeneous stream, they've teamed up with, for instance, Rester, which can recycle this in a mechanical way. And so they can also, in the end, get a new resource stock. And some of you may have, I checked a few months ago, and the price of cotton, for instance, had gone up by 100% of an increase in about 3 years. So it's also about ensuring resilience, tackling climate and nature goals through the same ways. And there, the circular economy can be a very valuable solutions framework. And I think, as the case of Rema also show, that it's for some the climate benefits are bigger, for some the land use related biodiversity impacts are bigger. So there's no one size fits approach, but when you have these partnerships, you can get farther than you could on your own. So I will stop there and take any questions that you might have.
Thanks so much, Tim. I think in the interest of time, I would pass on the floor to Justine now. She will introduce a few case studies of companies in the apparel industry that started their journey of integrating biodiversity into their decision making. And then I think when we have the full picture, we can move to the questions from the audience.
Thanks, Jana. Well, Jana's getting the slides up. Just to say there's a few questions in the chat that we can probably answer just quickly before as we go through. Yeah, next slide, thanks. So I'm from the Capitals Coalition. We're one of the partners on the Align project. And I've only got about 16 slides that I'll quickly run you through. Jana, if we can skip to the next slide. So first of all, I'll talk about the Natural Capital Protocol, which came out in, I think it's 2018, and has been used by a number of companies. We did some piloting, and since then there's been some more case studies as well. So I'll lead you through some of those case studies, and then I'll go into, a little bit about the case studies as well. So the case studies will include Second, Kering, Mud Jeans, and Hugo Boss. So a little bit about Natural Capital Protocol. It's a decision-making framework that enables organizations to essentially go through a step-by-step process in order to identify, measure, and value their direct and indirect impacts and dependencies on natural capital. Oh, yeah, no, we've lost the screen. Okay, there we go. So a little bit similar to what Tim presented on SBTM. It's a series of steps, and actually these are quite well aligned to each other because we've worked quite closely with SBTN, and so they developed their work, I guess, off the steps that we had identified as well. So we have 4 stages, which are broken down to 9 more detailed steps, and there's a series of questions that prompt you as you go through that process. So it's a tool designed to help you through the natural capital accounting application. And it's applicable to within any business sector, organizations of all sizes and all operational geographies. And if you look at the full set of case studies that we have online, it covers a whole range of different sectors. It's also supported by a number of supplements, guidance, tools. So we have a toolkit through the MIT Shift, which shows if you have certain applications potentially on water or air, it can guide you into a little bit more detail. There's also, we have training, a free online training course for the Natural Capital Protocol. I'll put all these in the links in our follow-up email. Actually, I forgot to put them in here. And also we have national hubs as well around the world of people coming together, sharing their experiences, and a central community site as well. Next slide. So in particular to the apparel sector, we have a specific guide that was developed through a collaboration which was led by TrueCost and the IUCN. The sector guide was funded by IFC with the support of the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from the Government of the Netherlands. So it just provides additional guidance that's specific to the apparel sector. And it provides hypothetical examples as well, which are really helpful. And so it provides a more of a practical experience of how to go through the process. And so these examples include, for example, a large multi-brand, multinational apparel retailer, or perhaps a wet processor, for example, a company that's involved in textile dyeing, and also a medium-sized cotton farm. So as you can imagine, throughout this whole supply chain of apparel, we hope that we had covered at least a broad range. So a lot of detail in there, and there's some links there that you can go into a little bit more detail about those guides and support. But what I'm going to give you today is just go into a couple of 4 case studies. So we'll start off with Second, and this is I guess we start off quite high level. So theirs was really about sustainability. So it's a very broad vision, and just into the next slide again. So, but they had a whole range of sustainability goals, what they call their vision goals, not just encompassing ecology, which was central to this, but also ecology, culture, and society. And so they had created They started as a small intentional community in 1977. It's gradually built up a community of organizations focused on holistic sustainable development. As you can imagine, operating in the desert is quite challenging. And so they've undertaken efforts to focus on models for optimizing water use, maximizing biodiversity, and shifting to renewable energy. And so they look at this as a whole holistic model. Next slide. So sorry if I'm rushing through this as well. The slides will be available later on. I'm just mindful to keep on track of time. So just key to this is, I guess, you saw that diagram before from Liesl about the ACT-D framework. So I've just got here the first steps of assess and commit. So as part of their assessment, they have a performance criteria across 64 ecological indicators, which they publish annually. And these are aligned with their KPIs, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN as well. And so this commitment that they have, it enables them to generate and disseminate models for optimizing water use, like I mentioned, optimizing biodiversity, reaching zero waste and carbon sequestration by 2027. And just in the next slide, this kind of gets to, I guess, the core aspect, which is about the oh, sorry, go back. I'm looking at the wrong slide. Thanks, Jana. It's always so weird when you're not managing your own slides. Key messages, I guess, is what really motivated them to do this, and what their lessons weren't through going through this process. So actively driving this systems change meant that they had to totally rethink not just production practices, but also their whole entire business model. And they had to shift to a nature positive business, and it was going to come one way or another. And so that's quite an interesting question. I think it's come up in some of the questions, like how do you motivate companies to do this? But it appears that it is coming anyway, and it's good to be, I guess, ahead of the curve. And you learn most by doing, not by waiting for risk-free scenarios. All these comments came from the company themselves. And then success, which is an interesting viewpoint. Success often breeds complacency. So it's, in other words, it's continuous improvement is needed, because it's quite easy to become, I guess, complacent when things are going well. So they have this these success factors, which is a culture of reinventing themselves every day, and enabling them, having this value added business units enables them to absorb costs of the biodynamic raw materials and compete with more conventional products. And also more on the social side of things, so speaking the language of their customers and their audience, and making sure that they're tailored to their audience, and this continuous investment in both the human development, which will drive employee motivation, health, retention, and productivity. So you can see it's quite broad, not just related to biodiversity. But some of the outcomes have been quite spectacular. So since 1977 to 2017, 2,100 hectares were converted to biodynamic organic production. 600,000 trees have been planted since their foundation. Quite a significant amount of CO2 sequestered, and a herbal tea brand which has 77% market share in Egypt. So having these criteria enables them to track their progress. So going into a little bit more detail on the next case study in caring. So this was probably one that you're quite familiar with. So I'd start off one that you've probably heard before, but it's still a good one. It was inspired by Mongolian goat herding and some of the environmental challenges that were faced in that environment, and the need to develop a sustainable cashmere supply chain. Cashmere is obviously a key part of the luxury brand of caring, and customers were increasingly asking for that to come from sustainable sources. So next slide. So this is a little bit about the story of what they called the cashmere crisis. I won't go into detail about it. You can read the slide a little bit later. But ultimately, as I mentioned, there was this need for high quality cashmere that came from sustainable sources, but there was an incredibly difficult operating environment in Mongolia, and with grazing pressure, the degradation of the native grasslands, and exacerbated by climate change. So through the Sustainable Cashmere Project, and in partnership with the Wildlife Conservation Society, they helped herders reduce the impact of their production and switch to more sustainable models. They've also worked with Stanford University and NASA, who joined the project in 2017 to source satellite data, which give them more information on how to monitor pasture quality and provide new information on which areas can support pasturing. And the next slide talks a little bit more about that sustainable business model. And this is the Kering's approach to use the capitals model, so that like that you saw in the natural capital protocol, to an environmental profit and loss approach to make decisions on the business activities. And so what this diagram shows is you've got the pressures or impact drivers down the left-hand side, so air emissions, greenhouse gases, and all the various tiers of operation across the companies, and from tier 0 right all the way through to tier 4. And it shows where the majority of the impacts lie. So as you can see, that the majority of the impacts were arising from the production of the raw material. And so this helped them to tailor solutions towards this area. And they have a target to reduce their impacts by 40% across the whole entire supply chain by 2025 relative to growth. So hopefully in a couple of years, we'll hear a little bit more about how they've got on with that and what the outcomes were. Next slide. I'm rushing through this, so apologies. But next slide is Mud Jeans. So Mud Jeans is all about a circular denim. Next slide. So circularity is key to their business model. I know this is a favorite one of Tim's, I think. So it was one of the inspirations of their CEO, Bert van Saun, who took on the challenge to create a fully circular denim brand. And there was an alternative to the fast fashion industry, or like the fast turnover aspect of the apparel industry. So they have, in 2019, they completed their second life cycle analysis with the support of EcoChain. They have a fully environmental impact assessment from cradle to grate. And the variables include water, CO2 consumption, land occupation, energy, and environmental costs. So quite a wide range of variables. So that already told them a great deal about their impact, but they wanted to, what was missing from this was the biodiversity element. So they then moved to a biodiversity inclusive LCA methodology. And one of the reasons, the motivations for them to do this, as well as the usual global drivers and internal risks and opportunities, they found that a survey of their customers in late 2019 ranked biodiversity the highest in terms of what environmental impact detail customers wanted to know about their products. So it was coming from the customers, and it's something that we can discuss in the next session. Next slide. So just a little bit more detail about the scope of their assessment and just the amount of the range of products that they looked at. You can go into this in a bit more detail in your own time. But the LCA endpoint modeling was used to measure the difference between the usual business's model, which you can see up there, and then the Mud Jeans value chain. And they also used the recipe impact methodology to obtain the biodiversity endpoint variable. And they use primary data from suppliers and eco-invent. So that detail can be quite helpful to other people trying to undertake this process themselves. And it just demonstrates on average, Mud Jeans has a biodiversity footprint that is 43% lower than the industry standard. So dark blue is the industry standard on the diagram on the right-hand side, and the Dun jeans, which is one of their brand of jeans, is the one in green. So you can see that they have 43% less footprint. So it gives them a really interesting data that they can then sell on into the marketplace and to the customers. So next example is Hugo Boss, again, a very well-known one, but this is probably the one that has taken it the furthest in terms of valuing that environmental impact. And they have been researching this quite closely with universities since, I think it was 2017. Maybe it says in the next slide, actually. Go to the next slide. Since 2009, actually. So way back, they've been conducting RCCs since 2009. But since 2016, they started doing a lot more detailed research using the natural capital protocol, but also undertaking, but also other initiatives that are going on at the same time, and working with universities to really delve into this idea. And a lot of their findings they have been able to share with the whole apparel sector. So this is supporting the whole industry. Could probably skip the detail of this slide and go to the next one. So that diagram back there just showed one example which I thought was quite interesting. It comes from, there is a link to this report on the first slide, and it just shows the life cycle analysis they had of silk ties and their impact on environmental issues. They've also got one for wool as well. So if you go to that report, you can see a little bit more detail about where the impacts are falling across different impact drivers. So here we've got climate change, water resource depletion, land use, and freshwater ecotoxicity. And so the next slide then applies valuation to that impact and shows that the majority, for silk ties at least, the majority of the impact is falling at the end here in terms of the assembly side. And this is where I think where the weaving process come into it. And also during the actual silk production itself. And so Hugo Boss have now set special targets in this area to help reduce their impacts. And as I mentioned, they were able to share the data that they gathered through this process through the World Apparel and Footwear Lifecycle Assessment Database, which is available for everyone to use. So yeah, that's a real quick rush through four case studies. There's a few more in the next slide. From Puma and also Arvind, and I know that the speakers who've spoken before have also shared some case studies as well. But we'll quickly segue into the discussion now, because I know there's some questions also in the chat. And one of the things that we want to do throughout all of our webinars is that we've been asking a series of Menti questions. So if we can quickly run through the Menti questions to start with, and then we can go into a bit more detail. But I try and weave in your questions as we go through as well. These Menti questions are important because we've been able to compare them across all our different webinars. This is now the 6th sector that we've looked at. And so it's interesting seeing some of the differences and responses across different sectors. So the next Menti question to come up is, what are the main challenges you see in the application of natural capital approaches? And here it's a multi-choice selection, just so that we can compare that across different sectors. But there's opportunity to have a discussion while you're filling that in. Let me just flip to another screen. So there were a couple of questions in the chat which relate to this about the main challenges. Let me just try and find them. There was one from Jonathan Aronson, which was it was very surprising that a lot of companies have not explored where they get their raw materials from, or they haven't explored, I guess, the impact of the whole entire supply chain. And obviously understanding where your raw materials come from seems like a first step. And so how do you go about encouraging companies to do this? And so this often what comes up as a challenge is, how do you encourage your senior management, your, your C-suite, that this is really important to the company? And so maybe a question for maybe Liesl and Tim. So what has been your experience in that question?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it comes back to where companies have prioritized their efforts, and a little bit around how supply chains swip and swap and change, that, we'd like to think we're moving away from, but that whole, competitive advantage has really been about anonymous supply chains, anonymity in supply chains. You move around, you follow the price, that's been quite a defining element of the apparel industry. I think it's changing now, and there's different tools available, and blockchain, and in various ways that traceability can be rolled out through a company. But if you can imagine, many companies will know their tier 1 suppliers. They're directly buying from their tier 1 companies, but then you've got to get back to, so that's either the assembly or the agents that are directly selling them the product, and then you've got the weavers and the knitters, and then back to the spinners, and then then if you think, a lot of the farmers are either very small landholders working within, maybe within cooperatives, or maybe alone, and then they're providing their raw materials into the gins or whatever, in the case of cotton. So there's lots of moving parts within a supply chain, and then there's lots of global supply chain. So it's a really big job. Where we've been focusing on is sort of country of origin, which is kind of doable. You can, and of course, you know, because we know where the majority of these materials are grown, you know, that information is known. So it's really up to the company to then start that process of mapping, of talking to its suppliers, of looking at the tools and technology that can support that. But I'll hand it over to Tim on the circularity front. There's a whole new layer of complexity when it comes to secondary raw materials and waste collection, isn't there?
I think there is, but the sort of silver lining there is also that reduces some of the complexity. If we, for instance, can recycle more of our textiles in, say, Finland, there's one plant in so in southwestern Finland where, well, they're said to process about 10% of the textiles collected here. So it means that there are 90% that you still need as input from somewhere else. So the problem doesn't go away, but I think there's less complexity if we have a more circular value chain. So I think that's a good thing. But it is, of course, if you work with setting science-based targets for nature, the first step is indeed doing your materiality assessment. There's no kind of getting around it. It is hard work. It is. But if you work, I think here again, the sort of silver lining, if you work with social issues, climate or nature, there's still just the value of doing that materiality assessment. And if you work with a natural capsule protocol, SPTN, TNFD, it doesn't really matter that there's still the basic elements are the same. But it is the kind of hard work that's hard to get around. But I think there are emerging technologies as well, for instance, with digital product passports that can provide more. So there's a big drive there that makes me quite optimistic that we can do these things not separate, but talking about, well, we talk about the twin transition, it's like, well, about the digital transition as well. So I think these things could work better hand in hand. So that makes me a little bit optimistic.
Thank you both. It's interesting seeing the outcomes from the Menti questions. So there's it's quite small on my screen, but there's a lack of internal resources. We often talk about capacity in this area, and I think even there's challenges in sustainable development, ESG indicators, and then to move that forward into evaluation is a whole nother area of capacity again. So I appreciate the responses to that one. Lack of data also comes up, but hopefully SBTN are seeking to address some of that, and also the Task Force for Nature Related Financial Disclosures has a whole knowledge hub, or what they call it, like a whole toolkit on tools and data that they you can apply through each step of their process. And then also lack of understanding of the business case. So thank you for those responses. We'll skip to the next Menti question, and I'll just keep the questions rolling. But the next Menti question is about what solutions do you think could overcome these challenges? This is a free form, so we welcome your comments in here. And whilst you're thinking about your responses to those challenges, I will come back to one of the questions in the chat, which was from Enrico, and I do apologize if I say your name wrong, but Shiogna. Which is on how do you define regeneration and agricultural raw material sourcing for the textile sector. I saw that you had answered that in the chat, Tim, but if you wanted to elaborate on that and then also maybe hand over to Lisa for a response.
Sure, I think that is a very, very good question. It is a sort of ambiguous term. This regenerative, what does it really mean? There's this concept of regenerative economics. It's used by some just to mean anything vaguely sustainable. But I think from a circular economy background, and I think that's also nicely aligned with SBTN, it's referring to, well, how I see it based on, well, biological cycles. So looking at biomass, it's about biological materials. So regeneration for, well, synthetic fibers, that is something different the way I see it. But there's, like I said, there's not one definition here, and there I think SBTN will provide more guidance on this in the, well, not in the first, well, the first part that's being launched in a couple of months, but later on I think there will be more guidance on that. But it is important to keep in mind that it is a sort of umbrella concept that draws upon different schools of thoughts. So thinking about how we can, I think if we just want to pin down three things, it's about making sure that we focus on soil health, and also that there's a renewal as part of that. It's in the word, right? Regeneration, and also looking at, well, 1/4 of our biodiversity is in soil. So it's about ensuring that diversity is a source of resilience and strength for our production system. So that's my take on it. but maybe Liesl will have another perspective.
I think you did a great job. I totally agree, and would just emphasize that there is a lot of different definitions in circulation, and they can range from, you know, no tilling, but everything else is sort of business as usual, right through to really holistic methods that Tim was referring to, and including, you know, recognition of Indigenous peoples and local communities, traditional methods, and, you know, just a whole range of aspects that could contribute to something being more holistic, you know, putting carbon back into the soil, but looking, you know, really holistically. I think the organic farming principles are fairly close. The standards don't necessarily require all those aspects. But yeah, it's really looking at that whole landscape and the holistic approach to improving soil health and everything that goes with it. But yeah.
Thanks, Liesl.
Put a link to one of our regenerative landscape analysis reports in the link that kind of pretty much says what we've been discussing.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question in the chat was about the link with the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. I guess that's aimed on sustainability indicators. This is maybe Align seeks to take this further into actual natural capital accounting and the valuation of those indicators, and that's where we're looking at not just the impact to business, but also the impact to society as well. So I guess the link is that it's taking what we aim to do through Align, and the recommendations is take that one step further to look at double materiality, for example. Did you have anything that you would want to add to that, Liesl and Tim? But CSRD.
I mean, just that we're in a really interesting time with you know, coming out of COP15 in Montreal and the new global biodiversity framework, and this recommendation. It hasn't been made mandatory, but to be disclosing and reporting on risks, impact, dependencies on nature, and then the various, you know, strengthening of standards and frameworks, TNFD being an obvious one, and just this huge momentum that's happening in the financial community as well as amongst businesses to sort of look at ways to reward and accelerate and scale the need to address nature loss. It's phenomenal how that interest and energy that there is in all sorts of different areas has sort of come together, and let's hope we don't lose that. So I think, just to kind of circle that random journey I just went on with the CSRD and other regulations and directives, it's going to just sort of be part of that nudging companies towards being able to report. And then the expectation is if you're able to report, then you're actually doing the work. And of course, we have to remember that that's the focus. The focus needs to be on the implementation, on the action, on getting things done, and not just the reporting. So yeah, I feel like there's lots of things moving around that.
Yeah, good point. Thank you. If we can move to the next Menti question, which is about lessons learned. Oh, there's a few more answers coming in actually. So thank you for your responses. We will a lot of it is around standardization and having standard reporting frameworks, which is great to see. It's what Liesl has been discussing about. That's where things are slowly heading towards. The next Menti question is about what lessons learned do you take away from these case studies, but also, I mean, the presentations that you've heard today. I guess a question for you, Liesl and Tim, is that across your broad case studies and your broad membership, there must be great diversity in how companies are are able to apply this, and their readiness to apply this and motivation to apply this. What's been your sort of experience from across that diversity of different companies?
I think for me, as I said, there's been a groundswell of interest and awareness, and and reports and sort of sharing of information, and that has created some sort of, I guess, overwhelm with some companies on, where do we start? What do we need to do? We're a very small company, we're a very large company, and to your point about not one size fits all, and what is that on-ramping into integrating nature and biodiversity and natural capital into a company's strategic planning. And I think there's lots of room for support and case studies. Everybody's looking for models of how other companies are doing this, and I think looking towards the SBTN and others that will start to really land some of the targets and methodologies and frameworks. I think what's going to be needed by large companies might be quite different from where small companies feel they can make the most impact, but collaboration is probably going to be key there too, to kind of build scale and contribution that might seem quite small into something that can be quite sort of transformational.
Thank you. And final words from you, Tim, as we've got a few minutes left.
No, I would just like to echo what I think Liesl said, that there's some of these companies that feel a little bit overwhelmed just getting this kind of, as I mentioned, the materiality assessment. That is the first step, and it can be quite difficult. And it was, as I was trying to say also with the examples, that there is no one size fits all approach, but there's a danger there as well, that you can sort of decide on what you think is important rather than having this sort of science-based approach where you see what are the boundaries under which we operate, basically, and what does that kind of compel us to deal with and focus on. So there's I think it's a very useful framework for thinking like that, but at the same time, that doesn't really make sense if we think of that 80 to 90%, as much of that biodiversity loss is related to land use. So there are these things that we really need to prioritize and to really pinpoint that we focus on the hotspots. But that, again, it doesn't focus on synthetic companies working with synthetic fibers, and I think that is why the apparel industry is so interesting, because there isn't a one size fits all approach. It's really, and you see the focus on pollution and climate. It's for example, like 20% of industrial wastewater is from the apparel industry. So of course, it's a small area if you look at kind of just land use, but so it really matters. Again, there is no one size fits all approach. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. But the value there is that if you also use circular business models, it doesn't matter if you're a synthetic company or if you're a bio-based one. You can use business models to repair, to offer products as a service so they last longer. So I think there are a lot of things we can do when we work toward this, even if our point of departure is very different. So it also makes me a little bit optimistic that we can do a lot with what we have.
That's a good place to end on, a bit of inspiration and hope. Thank you very much, Tim. I think I'll wrap up at this point, and just a big thank you for our speakers, Liesl and Tim, for sharing all your knowledge and wisdom and expertise. Thank you also to all the participants for your questions in the chat. If there's anything that we haven't answered, please do reach out to us or to the speakers. And also thank you for your responses on the Menti questions. We will go through those in more detail and analyze those. As you've heard, we're going to be busy this year doing more activities. So if you want to be involved in our community of practice or the community of interest, again, do reach out to me and I can link you into the teams who are overseeing that. The slides, recordings, key takeaways, and case studies will all be available online through a follow-up email. And thank you to everyone. Thank you very much.